The neighborhood prided itself on its manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and the kind of forced uniformity that made every street blend into the next like pages in a catalog. It was the sort of place where deviation, any deviation, felt like an offense to the architectural committee's personal honor. But to the homeowners who lived there, especially the families with young children, it was simply home. Quiet, predictable, and usually peaceful. The chalk drawings began on an unremarkable Saturday morning as an innocent pastime. The children, brimming with early summer energy, had taken to the sidewalk with a box of pastel-colored chalk. They drew sunbursts and hopscotch grids, swirling galaxies, crooked stick figures, and clumsy hearts that overlapped like joyous graffiti. Their creations sprawled across the concrete in a riot of color, a spontaneous celebration that made the normally sterile walkway bloom with temporary brightness. Parents passing by smiled politely at the display, charmed by the harmless creativity. But not everyone appreciated the change. Just 4 houses down lived the person the neighborhood informally referred to as the enforcer. The kind of resident who measured lawn height with a ruler and carried the HOA handbook like a Bible. She was known for her certainty that the community's rules were the only thing standing between their neighborhood and pure chaos. She was known for her tone, her complaints, and especially her persistence. And her name, of course, was Karen. Karen had spotted the chalk drawings during her morning inspection, the term she personally used, though no such position existed officially. She had paused in front of the sidewalk artwork, arms folded tightly, eyes narrowed as if the colors alone constituted a personal insult. She surveyed the drawings like they were creeping vines threatening the foundation of her home. Her expression hardened as she noted each line, each swirl, and each childish scribble. The neighborhood, in her view, had standards. And this explosion of color was, to her mind, the beginning of the end. She left the scene with the determination of someone preparing to wage a moral battle. The first sign of trouble came when a stiffly worded notice appeared on the family's door. A document that referenced a vague rule about exterior defacement and community visual harmony. Phrases that had likely been misinterpreted and stretched to fit her argument. The parents read the notice with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Chalk, after all, was temporary. It washed away with a single rain or a quick rinse with the garden hose. No harm, no permanece. Nothing even remotely close to actual vandalism. The family chose to ignore the complaint, chalking it up, quite literally, to Karen being herself. After all, the HOA received her grievances so frequently that many of them were quietly dismissed before reaching anyone of consequence. The parents reasoned that, as usual, the ridiculousness of the matter would resolve itself. And for a short while, it seemed like that might be true. But Karen was far from finished. Over the next few days, she patrolled the sidewalk, glaring at the drawings as though they were multiplying specifically to antagonize her. Each new chalk addition became another piece of evidence in her growing mental case file. She snapped photographs at different angles, compiling a gallery of supposed infractions. More complaints were sent, each more urgent in tone, as if she were reporting a wildfire rather than whimsical children's art. When the HOA failed to respond quickly enough for her liking, she escalated. She contacted city code enforcement. The call she made was lengthy and embellished. She portrayed the chalk drawings as something far more malicious, suggesting neglect, property damage, and visual disruption of a scale that might be considered absurd if not for the commitment with which she described it. She insisted that the city had an obligation to restore order and protect property values. To her surprise, the city took the report seriously enough to schedule an inspection, if only because any official complaint, regardless of its nature, required documentation. Word of the impending visit traveled slowly through the neighborhood. Most residents had no idea why inspectors were coming. A few noticed Karen cleaning her porch with exaggerated effort, glancing down the street as if anticipating applause when the inspectors arrived. Others observed the family at the center of the situation lingering on their porch, puzzled and anxious as they wondered what exactly they had done to attract official attention. The morning of the inspection arrived with clear skies and the faint smell of cut grass. The chalk drawings were still visible, faded in some spots from foot traffic but still bright enough to charm anyone with a sense of whimsy. Neighboring families paused their routines to watch from behind curtains or over fences, curious about the spectacle. When the city vehicle pulled onto the street, Karen emerged from her home almost instantly, walking briskly toward the inspectors with the confident stride of someone convinced they were about to be validated. She gestured dramatically as she guided them toward the sidewalk, eagerly pointing out the drawings as if unveiling evidence of a crime. The inspectors listened politely, but their expressions carried the unmistakable neutrality of professionals who had seen far more serious complaints. They examined the sidewalk with mild interest, taking notes simply because protocol required it. They observed the chalk art, cheerful suns, uneven rainbows, and a crooked depiction of a family cat, and saw nothing alarming. They saw what any reasonable person would see: harmless children's creativity. The longer the inspectors stood there, the more obvious it became to the watching neighbors that Karen's narrative wasn't landing the way she hoped. Her gesturing grew more animated, her tone more insistent. She pointed at one drawing, then another, as if repetition might convince the inspectors that something dangerous was afoot. But the inspectors simply continued their evaluation, stepping carefully over the artwork so as not to disturb it. Meanwhile, the family responsible for the drawings watched from their porch, uneasy yet hopeful. Their children peeked out from behind the front door, holding the chalk that had started this entire bizarre chain of events. The parents reminded themselves that chalk washes away, and surely the city officials would see the situation for what it was. And indeed, they did. But before they made their final determination, they requested to speak with the family, noting that they needed a complete picture of the circumstances. The parents agreed and stepped forward, prepared to explain the innocence of the drawings. They described the children's activity, the temporary nature of chalk, and how they had received the initial HOA notice. As they spoke, other neighbors began to gather, openly supportive and eager to reinforce the obvious: that the drawings were far from a nuisance and had even brought a sense of joy to the block. The inspectors listened, nodded, and took additional notes. Karen, standing just a few steps away, grew increasingly tense. Her arms were crossed tightly, and her gaze burned with irritation as the narrative shifted away from her control. She had expected outrage. She had expected the inspectors to react with concern. Instead, they seemed bewildered that she had escalated such a trivial matter. It wasn't long before the inspectors concluded their visit, promising to file their report with the city office. Karen, still confident she had swayed them, returned to her porch with a self-satisfied expression. The family, however, sensed the outcome might lean heavily in the opposite direction. The neighbors exchanged glances, murmuring to one another about what might come next, and the inspectors, before driving away, gave a subtle but telling nod to the parents, one that suggested clarity had landed exactly where it should. What none of them knew yet was that the report being filed would not reflect Karen's complaints at all. In fact, it would become the beginning of consequences she had never anticipated. The city's inspection report took 3 days to process, but during those days the neighborhood simmered with quiet anticipation. Most residents went about their usual routines, watering lawns, walking dogs, chatting near mailboxes. Yet everyone found excuses to linger a little longer outdoors, as though they might overhear news the moment it arrived. Children continued to add to the chalk drawings, though now they glanced nervously up the street, uncertain whether their art might prompt another unexpected confrontation. Karen, meanwhile, acted as though victory were inevitable. She carried herself with the triumphant posture of someone who believed her crusade had restored order to the community. She checked her mailbox multiple times a day, expecting an official confirmation of her success. She paced her porch with the air of an overseer, watching children play with narrowed eyes, her expression communicating that she alone guarded the moral and aesthetic standards of the street. She believed she had single-handedly preserved property values. In her mind, she was the hero. But 3 days after the inspection, a set of envelopes arrived, one for the family whose children had created the chalk drawings, one for the HOA, and notably one for Karen herself. The envelopes bore the city's emblem, which immediately drew curious attention. Residents discreetly observed from their windows as the mail carrier deposited them. The moment the envelopes landed in mailboxes, the atmosphere shifted. Something felt different. Something felt imminent. The family was the first to open theirs. The parents unfolded the document cautiously, scanning the paragraphs with held breath. Within seconds, their shoulders relaxed. A wave of relief softened their faces. The report stated clearly and firmly that the chalk art posed no violation of any municipal code. It was deemed temporary, non-destructive, and well within acceptable use of public sidewalks. The city saw no need for enforcement action. More than that, the report commended the family for fostering creativity among neighborhood children. But the most surprising part lay in the final paragraph. The report mentioned the possibility of a misuse of city resources due to a complaint found to be exaggerated and knowingly misleading. The city would be pursuing follow-up measures with the individual who filed the complaint. The family looked at one another in disbelief, the kind in which shock blended seamlessly with vindication. They hadn't asked for consequences. They had hoped only for common sense. But seeing the city recognize the absurdity of the situation felt like a weight lifting off their shoulders. Word spread fast. By late afternoon, whispers traveled from porch to porch. Neighbors shared snippets of the report, trading interpretations and opinions. Several residents gathered on the sidewalk near the chalk drawings, examining each figure as though they had gained new significance. The artwork shimmered faintly in the sunlight, dusting the concrete with color, each line now a symbol of the thick irony that hung over the block. But the greatest tension centered around Karen, who still had not appeared, until she did around 5 o'clock. Karen marched down her driveway holding her own envelope. Her grip was stiff. Her expression was tight, pinched, and burning with disbelief. She paced back and forth near the mailbox, opening the report again and again, as if rereading it might alter its contents. It was clear that the words were not what she expected. It was clear that the city's response had rattled her. For the first time in a long while, Karen looked unsure. She retreated into her house, her door closing harder than necessary. The neighbors exchanged raised eyebrows. A rare silence settled, each person privately imagining what the city might do next. No one had seen the exact wording of Karen's notice, but the glimpses they'd witnessed told a story. The city was not amused. Inside her home, Karen stewed. She had always functioned on the edge of absolute certainty. Certainty that she was right, certainty that rules justified her complaints, certainty that the community depended on her vigilant oversight. But the report shattered that assurance. It suggested that her perspective was not only flawed but wasteful. It repositioned her from guardian to nuisance, and she did not know how to reconcile that shift. Her anger simmered quietly at first, then grew into something sharper as she interpreted the city's wording as a personal insult. Karen convinced herself the city was mistaken, that the neighbors were conspiring, that the HOA had become complacent, that the chalk drawings represented something larger. Proof that the neighborhood was slipping into chaos. She considered drafting new complaints, escalating the matter further, or even contacting the mayor's office. Yet each thought was tinged with hesitation. The city's wording had unnerved her. She sensed that pushing further might bring more scrutiny, and scrutiny was exactly what she received. 2 mornings after the reports were delivered, a city vehicle returned. The neighborhood buzzed with instant alertness. Curtains shifted. Garage doors halted mid-close. Even dogs paused their barking as if sensing the tension. But the vehicle did not stop at the family's home this time. It stopped in front of Karen's. The code enforcement officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, and approached her door. Neighbors discreetly gathered in driveways, forming a silent audience. Karen eventually opened the door, face flushed and complexion tight. The officer spoke professionally, explaining the purpose of the visit. Though no one could hear the exact words, the body language was unmistakable. This was not a social call. This was about her. Karen's demeanor changed rapidly from defensive to indignant, then to anxious as the officer walked with her around the perimeter of her property. What began as a focused conversation soon expanded into a full inspection. The officer examined items Karen had long assumed were invisible to consequences. Overgrown shrubs creeping past the easement line, a decorative lawn fixture placed outside regulation distance, a trash bin slightly visible from the street, a cracked stone border she had never bothered to repair. Each detail, minor but technically enforceable, was noted. The inspection lasted nearly an hour. When it ended, Karen stood in her driveway clutching a stack of documents. Multiple citations, each outlining a required correction and an associated fine. Her expression was stunned, almost hollow. The officer thanked her for her time and left, driving away slowly while the neighbors tried to appear busy despite their obvious fascination. News spread like lightning. The chalk drawings, once the center of conflict, were now symbols of poetic justice. The family at the center of it all watched the events with a mixture of disbelief and guilt. They had not sought revenge, nor had they intended for Karen's life to be scrutinized so thoroughly. But the consequences had arrived naturally, the result of her own escalation. Karen spent the rest of the day indoors. Her blinds remained closed. The street felt calmer without her constant patrolling. The children continued their chalk drawings timidly at first, then more confidently as the evening sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. The neighborhood exhaled. But the consequences were not yet finished. The citations were only the beginning, and the HOA, now fully aware of Karen's complaints to the city, was preparing its own response. The layers of fallout were still unfolding, each one revealing pieces of a truth no one had expected. Karen's battle against chalk art had opened a door she could no longer close. In the days following the city's inspection of Karen's property, the neighborhood settled into an odd mixture of calm and anticipation. The chalk drawings remained on the sidewalk, bright as ever, though now they held an entirely new significance. No longer simple children's art, but a symbol of unity, defiance, and poetic justice. Parents lingered on porches longer than usual. Children played freely, chalk dust coating their fingers and shoes, and every resident kept a cautious eye on Karen's home, half expecting another eruption. But instead of outwardly retaliating, Karen fell silent. Her blinds stayed perpetually closed. Her car remained motionless in the driveway. No mail pickups, no porch sweeping, no morning patrols. Her absence left a void, one that the neighborhood didn't miss but continually noticed. It was as though she had retreated into her home to regroup, nursing the sting of fines and citations she hadn't believed possible. She had spent years evading scrutiny by redirecting her attention outward, but the tables had turned, and she was facing the consequences alone. Meanwhile, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. They had received their own copy of the city's report, which included pointed remarks about misuse of municipal resources and a suggestion that the HOA review its complaint protocol. The board was not pleased. They had long grown weary of Karen's constant grievances. Her emails alone required a folder dedicated solely to her name, and her habitual misinterpretations of the guidelines often created more confusion than clarity. The meeting stretched well into the night. Though the board members kept their discussion private, it wasn't long before word leaked that Karen's actions had placed the HOA itself under scrutiny. Municipal oversight was the last thing any HOA wanted. It meant paperwork, risk, and, worst of all, accountability to an outside authority. The board needed a solution, swift, decisive, and public enough to demonstrate responsibility. The solution arrived in the form of a formal notice. The next morning, a pristine white envelope was taped to Karen's door. The bold HOA insignia at the top of the page was visible even through the small pane of glass. Neighbors noticed immediately. Several lingered near their mailboxes, suddenly absorbed in checking for non-existent letters, hoping to catch Karen's reaction. When Karen finally emerged, disheveled, tense, and visibly anxious, she removed the notice with trembling hands and opened it on the spot. As she read, her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to a cold, simmering outrage. The HOA was issuing sanctions against her. The notice cited habitual filing of baseless complaints, misuse of community reporting channels, and actions resulting in reputational harm and municipal involvement. It imposed a fine, smaller than the city's but symbolic in its message, and it required her to attend a mandatory compliance hearing. The HOA, usually a reluctant and bureaucratic institution, had finally reached its breaking point. And the catalyst had been chalk drawings created by children with no understanding of the complexities of community governance. Karen stood frozen in her driveway, the notice fluttering slightly in the breeze. She looked around the neighborhood as though seeing it for the first time. Where she once saw disorder and potential violations, she now saw eyes watching her, curious, cautious, and perhaps a bit vindicated. Not hostile but aware. A shift had occurred, and she could feel it pressing against her. Yet even as the consequences gathered around her, Karen was not ready to surrender. She spent the remainder of the day pacing her living room, drafting responses, rereading the HOA bylaws, and combing through old emails. She believed she could argue her way out of the sanctions. She believed she could expose loopholes, find clauses that would validate her actions, or at least shift blame. She clung to the idea that she had acted in the best interest of the community. It was a conviction that had defined her for years, but the ground had shifted beneath her feet. And when the day of the HOA hearing arrived, she realized just how much. The hearing was held at the small, echoing community center near the entrance to the neighborhood. It was meant to be a closed meeting, but the turnout was larger than expected. Word had spread, and residents who had dealt with Karen's complaints over the years arrived early, waiting silently in the hallway outside the meeting room. The atmosphere was stiff, charged with unspoken history. Inside the room, Karen sat across from the 5 HOA board members. Papers were arranged neatly before them. The board president cleared his throat, and the hearing began. Instead of condemnation, what followed was quiet, methodical, and undeniably firm. The board outlined Karen's history of excessive complaints, nearly 100 formal submissions in 3 years. They detailed the number of hours spent addressing them, the conflicts they had caused among neighbors, and the unnecessary involvement of city officials. They emphasized the final point. Filing a knowingly misleading complaint was grounds for disciplinary action. Karen sat rigid, her face growing paler as each point was read aloud. She attempted to interject several times, but each interruption was met with gentle yet decisive redirection. There were no loopholes to exploit, no hidden clause to rescue her. The board concluded with their decision. The fines would stand. Any future complaints filed by her would require documented evidence and board pre-review. Repeated violations would result in suspension of her voting privileges within the HOA. And if her actions continued to cause disruption, she would face further consequences, including potential legal review. When the hearing ended, Karen emerged into the hallway where residents stood waiting in quiet solidarity. No one spoke. No one confronted her. They simply watched as she walked past them, her posture stiff and unsteady. For a woman who had spent years believing she commanded the moral authority of the neighborhood, the silence was more devastating than any spoken reprimand. She returned home without raising her eyes. The neighborhood slowly shifted back to normal in the days that followed. Children once again filled the sidewalks with chalk art, bigger, brighter, and bolder than before. Their drawings sprawled across the pavement in joyful abundance, free of fear or complaint. Parents watched with relief, neighbors exchanged easy conversation, and the community felt lighter than it had in years. Karen, though quieter now, remained part of the neighborhood. She tended to her fines, repaired the issues cited by the city, and kept to herself. She didn't watch the street with suspicion anymore. She didn't patrol or photograph or report. Whether it was humility, exhaustion, or reluctant acceptance, no one could say for certain. But the change was unmistakable. And the greatest sign of all came one warm afternoon when a group of children decorated the sidewalk directly in front of her house with a giant rainbow stretching from one driveway to the next. The parents watched nervously, unsure whether this would test whatever fragile peace had settled. But Karen did not emerge. She simply let the chalk remain. Bright, sprawling, unapologetically colorful. The neighborhood knew, then, that the story had reached its natural end. A conflict born from something as simple as children's chalk drawings had unraveled years of tension, revealed long-ignored patterns, and reshaped the community's shared understanding. It had exposed how fragile harmony could be, and how easily it could be restored with accountability and collective support. The chalk eventually faded with the rain, but the shift it created remained. And so the battle Karen began ended not with revenge, but with consequence, closure, and the quiet triumph of common sense. Proving once again that sometimes the smallest things, drawn in dust and color, could redraw the lines of an entire neighborhood.